Hello, I'm Andrew, and in this video you're going to see me cook a bunch of spinach. It's actually several bunches of spinach. This is part of an ongoing series on the channel where I cook many recipes featuring one ingredient. I'm usually making things I've never made before, not always getting it exactly right, but there's something about experiencing the same ingredient over and over again that can teach you a lot about it. And it's also very fun for me. Spinach is kind of a boring ingredient. I don't find myself wanting to eat spinach specifically, but there are so many recipes that feature spinach heavily that I love and do find myself wanting to eat. It's a little bit of a contradiction, but I think it makes sense. So I've already made all these recipes, and now I'm gonna take you through how those experiences went. The first thing I made was sautéed spinach. Very basic sautéed spinach. Lots of recipes will recommend using baby spinach for this sort of preparation, but I wanted to use the big leafy bunches of spinach that tend to be a little less expensive and I think embrace the true spirit of spinach, which is having a ton of this hardy green that you need to find something to do with. So I began by cleaning all of my spinach, and these being some of the more mature leaves, I separated some of the more fibrous stems from the leaves to just give the sautéed spinach a little bit of a better texture. Then in my biggest pot, I heated up some olive oil with a ton of sliced garlic, along with some dried chili to just sort of infuse a little bit of spice into the oil. When the garlic was just at the point of threatening to turn golden, I tossed in all of the spinach, covered it so that all of that trapped steam could rapidly wilt down the volume of spinach. And you could see this was, I think, almost 2 pounds of spinach, and it immediately reduced into basically nothing. I simmered it a little while longer so that some of that moisture could evaporate, and then I seasoned with salt and a little bit of vinegar. For me, this is one of the best ways to eat a vegetable, and I think it's even arguably a lot easier than making a simple salad. The spinach, of course, continues to leak liquid, and then once it combines with the oil and the vinegar, you get this very delicious juice at the bottom. And then you just get that single vegetable tasty liquid. And I think it's a very clear picture of what is the flavor of spinach. It's this minerally green flavor. The next thing I made was a chicken ballotine. And this is actually the real reason why I wanted to saute all that spinach, so that I could use it as a stuffing for this chicken. This is actually one of the first things that I made on About to Eat, and I wanted to revisit it to see if my skills had improved. And I once again referenced the technique from Jacques, Pépin, where you remove all of the bones from the chicken without breaking too much of the skin so that it could be used to be stuffed. So I began by removing the wishbone. You then make an incision along the spine of the chicken. You then make a cut at each articulation of the wings, which then allows you to sort of pull down all of the flesh of the chicken off of the carcass. You then cut around the chicken oysters on the back and continue to pull it down, where you then make another couple of cuts at the articulation of the leg, which then allows you to fully pull away all of the meat and flesh from the carcass of the chicken. And actually all that remains are the 2 breast tenders, which are still attached to the keel bone at the center of the chicken, which you can then just remove with your fingers. I then find the thigh bone and scrape away the flesh until it reaches the bottom. And then turning it right side out again, I break the bone with the blunt side of a knife so that the skin is not broken and the whole bone can be removed in one piece. I don't do the cleanest job here, but all of these pieces and scraps can be saved later for making a stock. You then do the same thing with the drumettes at the top, and there you have the entire chicken deboned with most of the skin and meat still intact in one layer. So for my stuffing, I had some dried croutons that I made. I had the leftover sautéed spinach that I added some sautéed green onion to. I then added some miscellaneous herbs and some cubed Gruyère cheese. Then spread this out on the inside of the chicken and carefully fold both sides together, flipping it over and then tying the legs together, and then using a hitch knot along the length of the chicken to tie everything together. So then in my Dutch oven, I browned each side of the chicken, and I've always had this oval-shaped Dutch oven and never really used it for any oval-shaped things, and this was the first time I did that. And I was pretty pleased at how perfectly this chicken fit inside. Once all the sides were browned, that went into the oven for about 45 minutes. I let it rest a little while longer, and then it was time to slice. And this time around, I do think I did a much better job. My proportion of stuffing this time was more spinach, so everything seemed to stay a little moister. And because I'm using this leftover sauteed spinach, it's very saturated with flavor, which then serves to flavor this whole chicken. I think usually a difficulty with roasting a whole chicken is that it's hard to season the underside of the meat. Does this chicken count as a meatloaf? It's a question I have. The next thing I made was Palak Paneer. And I referenced a recipe from the YouTube channel Rajshri Food. So I began by making the base of the dish by heating some ghee and adding cumin seed and some dried red chilies. I then added minced garlic and some diced red onion. When all of that was golden, some diced tomato and garam masala. I then allowed that to cook until most of the liquid was evaporated. In the meantime, I washed 2 big bunches of spinach and blanched them in boiling water before shifting them to a bowl of ice water to cool them down rapidly. That all then went into a blender, which I processed until almost pureed. When I saw that the liquid had reduced enough in my pan, I added all that spinach, allowed it to simmer, and checked for salt. I then diced the paneer and added that to the pot as well. Lots of recipes I was checking out suggested adding cream or more butter to enrich the dish, but I wanted to stop at this point to experience that pure spinach flavor. And it is incredible how just so few ingredients can turn into something so full tasting, especially when it's allowed to reduce and then sit for a long period. You know, it's one of those things that just melds into such a big flavor. The next thing I made was Spanakopita, a dish I love so much, but have honestly never made myself. I began by washing and prepping my spinach and then wilting it in a large pot. In a separate pan, I sauteed some green onion and garlic. Often this is done in the same pan, like sauteing the green onion first and then adding the spinach, but I thought that this would save time, especially since I had such a large volume of spinach. I then chopped a bunch of different herbs, mint, parsley, dill. I even had some leftover basil that I threw in for the hell of it. Into that, I crumbled a large block of feta and a couple of eggs and mixed thoroughly. I also added some leftover ricotta cheese because I had it and because I thought I could use a little bit more cheesy moisture. In a large pan, I started brushing down some melted butter and layering the filo sheets. I used one of my pans that's very large in area because I wanted to sort of emulate this flatter spanakopita I've had. My last layers of filo I'm allowing to hang over the edge of the pan, and then all of the mixture goes in. I then carefully folded over each of those sheets and then started adding more sheets of filo overlapping them. And I wasn't sure that this would work, but I ended up using a silicone spatula to sort of tuck in the seams down the side of the pie so that everything was sort of rounded in the corners. I then pre-scored the filo so that it would be easier to cut later and so that any excess moisture could more easily evaporate. Into the oven that went, and about 45 minutes later, I had a beautiful golden top. I actually consider myself very lucky for pulling it out when it did, because the bottom was just approaching the point where it might have gotten too dark, but it was actually this beautiful dark gold crunchy layer. The super soft greens, when they're compacted into that dense pie, is a very unique and pleasing texture. It's almost like a very thick, savory icing. And then that delicious texture of the crunchy filo. And classic spinach problem, I thought I had so much, but I honestly could have had maybe 50% more filling in that same volume of pan, and it would have been great. The last thing I made were Spinach Tortelli. And for these, I referenced the recipe from the Pasta Grannies cookbook. To start, I washed a mountain of spinach. I then blanched it in boiling water and thoroughly strained it. And despite starting with maybe 2.5 pounds of spinach, it reduced down to this little clump. I then put that spinach in a blender and processed with eggs and a little olive oil. I then took some 00 flour, which indicates how finely it's been milled, and made a mound of that into which I poured that green concoction. I then carefully incorporated the flour, slowly at first, until folding it all into the ball, and then kneading it for a few minutes until smooth. Though if I'm being honest, when do I ever not knead pasta? I then made the filling with some of the spinach that I had portioned off, mixed that with ricotta, Parmesan cheese, and salt and pepper to taste. Once the dough had adequately rested, I cut off a small portion and started rolling it through the pasta making attachment for my stand mixer, incrementally adjusting it until it got thinner and thinner. Finally, I had a long sheet of glorious green pasta dough. And then trimmed that to a long rectangle, which I then divided into squares. And after that first batch, I actually increased the size to 3 by 3. Putting a dollop of that filling in the center and then carefully folding it over and crimping the sides, trying to not get the filling on the seam, which would prevent the dough from forming together. In a pot of salted boiling water, I dropped in the tortelli for a few minutes until straining them into a pan with melted butter, which I tossed for a few minutes until finishing with Parmesan cheese. The color is stunning. It's cheese stuffed pasta. It's delicious. When making this pasta, I found myself wondering, what is spinach doing here? Wouldn't this be just as good if it was a regular pasta dough with some cheese filling inside? It wouldn't be exactly the same, but spinach doesn't taste all that much, right? But I think it's important to consider back in time when these recipes were invented. It probably wasn't about, oh, I love spinach, what can I make with spinach? But rather, we have so much spinach right now, what will we make with spinach? And I think it's that necessity and invention that's important to consider when making anything. Not what's the tastiest thing I can eat, but how can I make what I'm eating the tastiest? Well, that's how I cooked many bunches of spinach. I hope you enjoyed. If there's another spinach recipe that I missed that you think I should make, or if you have suggestions on ingredients I should cover in the future, I'd love to hear about it. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching.